Kristian Stålne. How do you say your last name in English?
Stålne.
Stålne, yeah.
Thank you for asking.
Welcome to the Strategic Tech Coaching Podcast.
Thank you.
Yes. So yeah, I shared before we put on the mics that I've been living in Dubai for a long time. So I have this question that I used for a long time, that if you and me and there's a third guy, we're going to Sky Bar in Dubai, and there's a lift, and the third guy asks, "So Kristian, what do you do?" What would you tell him?
A bit of everything. Right now, I'm pretty much engaged in the Inner Development Goals project and initiative, where we try to map out the inner development that needs to take place in order for us to be better at addressing the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. So basically, this has an assumption that we're not doing well in terms of sustainability. So we need some sort of change, and the change that we're looking for here is the inner change. So we need to develop our skills and capacities so that we hopefully be able to solve or at least address the complex issues that we have before us in terms of sustainability. So that's kind of where I'm engaged in now. Otherwise, I would say I'm an engineer. I have an engineering background. I'm a senior lecturer at Malmö University, teaching at the construction engineering program. But also I have one leg, and the other leg is in psychology and adult development psychology. So these things pretty much come together in the IDG project.
Yeah. So basically, I grew up with a mom that worked with personal development. She worked with happiness at work. She worked with consultants and training, and a father that comes from an engineering background. Everyone on my father's side is an engineer. Like my uncle invented the digital caliper, and my other uncle worked in Ericsson, like hardcore engineers. And for me, those two lines are quite different. So when you say that you teach engineering and adult psychology, share about this, because for me it's kind of different approaches, different personality types.
Yeah, I think it is, and I struggle with it because those parts needs to fit some way in me. So there is a story to be told here, I think, to kind of explain how I got here. And I grew up in Stockholm, and in a home full of music, and that's kind of one option for me was to go in that path, but I didn't. I also thought that mathematics and physics was interesting, so I started studying in Lund, civil engineering program, and I got a master's degree in engineering physics. That went very well for me, so that seemed to be my path. And then I started my PhD studies, and also I got a dog, so I started with dog training as well. So I started with the training dogs for tracking and trailing and obedience and things like that. And I thought that was fun as well. But then when I was as a PhD student, things didn't work out well for me. I had a hard time kind of setting my own boundaries and describing asking my own questions, and kind of it didn't kind of feel natural to me to be in that environment. So I started to question myself, to doubt myself. And also I came into, due to my dog training, and I was competing somewhat with the dogs. And dogs are very sensitive for when you kind of, if you are nervous, the dog feels it and do different things than you do on the training. So we were a couple of persons at the club who was interested in mental training and sports psychology. So we hired a kind of trainer to help us and lecture for us. And that kind of, it was really interesting for me. So I kind of thought that, okay, here I got the keys. I know what I need to do in order to finish my PhD, because that's kind of, I was struggling with that. So I think I have some good tools here. And that's kind of one world that opened up for me. Look, there are tools for how to control yourself, how to control your mindset, so you can be productive and do what you think.
So you use sports psychology to finish your PhD then? Or?
I tried. It didn't work. It didn't work for me, but
Okay.
it opened up something for me. But I know you
Okay.
have some background in that as well.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, I mean, this is my background, mental training, and you know, this in NLP, which is something that I study a lot. You work a lot with your emotional state, and it's interesting with dogs and how they can feel your emotional state and how important it then becomes to manage your own emotional state to manage the dog. You know.
Yeah. So yeah, from mental training, I also got interested in NLP and started to looking, well, okay, how can I control my mind some way? And I really loved the thought about modeling. So for instance, if you have some successful person in doing something, you can model that. I liked that thought, but I never kind of succeeded in it. And also that's kind of, my conclusion there was, okay, here are some interesting tools, but what I've discovered then, why didn't it work for me in the PhD for my PhD, is still I discovered that I didn't know why I wanted to finish my PhD.
Okay.
I think that, okay, I have some tools here, but I don't know why. So I started writing long lists. How do I convince myself? Do I want fame? You don't get that much fame from a PhD. Do I want a high salary? No. Do I want a career? I struggled, so I don't know what I want in life. So maybe you can see it's like a sort of quarter life crisis or something like that. But it's kind of, it started as a kind of what do I want practically? And I need to know that in order to kind of finish my PhD, because it was hard work. But also, what do I want with life? So it's kind of, it grew from the kind of very small practical question to what do I want from life? And that's flipped to what does life want from me? Also, so it became an existential crisis, and I started to look for meaning in life.
Aren't crises a great opportunity to learn and grow as a person?
Can be.
Yeah,
I mean,
it can be.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Not always, I think, but it can be.
Yeah.
And for me, asking existential questions about meaning turned me from psychology, from the psychological perspective, to the spiritual. Kind of what is life, and what does life want from me? I wanted to find some higher purpose, but I grew up in this was in the 00s, like 03, 05, 2003, somewhere there, and kind of a very secular society in Sweden. Not much happening in the world. We were post 9/11, and kind of the climate crisis started to kind of get some traction also, but I kind of didn't. There was also time for me to say, what is life? To have kind of ask myself those questions, and started becoming interested in Buddhist perspectives, Buddhist practices. Not that much practices. I'm a thinker, so I started kind of trying to analyze and kind of make sense of the world. And then I found that's kind of, I got deeper into the rabbit hole and didn't find it useful at all, until I found an American guy called Ken Wilber that I think we will talk a bit about.
Yes, absolutely.
What I liked about Wilber was that, yes, he wanted to dive deep into the spiritual realm, but he also wanted to tie in the psychological perspectives that I found useful, but I couldn't fit it into the larger questions, and also tell a story about how we came to this world, how we came how we came to this point where we are now, how I came to this point where I am. So it kind of, that opened up a lot of perspectives for me.
Interesting. Yeah. Shall we share the model from Ken Wilber, and then see? Because like the engineering rational mind, and then you went to the Buddhist thinking, and so, which is quite different.
It's still far apart from where I started, and the problems I wanted to solve.
Yeah. So if you're listening to this, the integral model, or can you share a little bit how the model is for those listening that cannot see the picture?
Yeah, this is the most widespread result from Wilber's journey is a model called the integral theory, or AQUAL, Equal means all quadrants, all levels, all states, all types. So quadrants is basically when we look at experience, when we look at life, and when we look at our reality, we can say that, okay, we are only look at the material world, or only we are looking internally. So we have, first of all, the exterior perspective or interior perspective. So exterior are atoms and bodies and systems and everything. And interior, that's where we have kind of our subjective experience or intersubjective experiences as well. And that's kind of harder to measure, but because we need to kind of ask ourselves or ask other people, what do you experience now, in order to kind of access the inner aspect of it. So that's kind of one way of kind of divide the world, divide the entire universe into an outer and an inner half. And then you can make a split in another way also, in individual part and a collective part. And then you can ask yourself, for instance, whatever you see, do you see that as an object in itself, or do you see that as rather several things? You see that, am I, for instance, as a human being, am I fundamentally an individual, or am I fundamentally a part of a larger picture, a larger kind of my relations or my society? So then we can split it between individual collective. So if we take these and cross these two splits, then we get the 4 quadrants. And with the individual interior is my psychological perspective, it's my subjective experience of thoughts, emotions, and memories. And then the individual and exterior, that's kind of what I studied in engineering, which is the kind of bodies, atoms.
The engineering mind, kind of.
The engineering mindset. And the engineering mindset is also in the exterior and collective, because my background in my PhD was in structural mechanics. Then you see not only in different bodies, but rather systems of bodies and how they fit together, and how you can make computer models of a car, for instance, or a building or a bridge, is being by puzzling together different methods and different pieces. So that's kind of the lower right collective exterior interobjective perspective. And finally, interior collective, that's the we space, kind of if we have shared some sort of shared meaning in our conversation, Oskar, you and I, then we have some understanding. I say something, my words make you nod in a way back because you understand what I say. We have shared meaning, and then we create something. We create a shared space, and it could be between you and I, and it can also be in a culture in an organization, or a culture in Sweden, for instance. If we look at the current state of, we have debates around joining the NATO or not. So that's kind of taking place in the cultural sphere. We have different opinions going back and forth, and we have a shift in opinions due to the invasion in Ukraine, for instance. So it's what happens in the cultural realm is also important.
So if you're listening to this, and you can later Google just Ken Wilber integral map, or what should I Google to find this the
integral theory, Wilber integral theory, or AQAL, AQAL also.
Okay. So for me, one explanation I heard was, for example, we have a cat now, and I love my cat, and when I look at her playing and I play with her, I just get these like emotions inside of me. And that's subjective, because you cannot, how do you measure it? I mean, you can see I'm smiling, and we can see my body language, which is maybe you can measure, but my inner emotions you cannot really see, So
exactly.
From my point of view, I had lived in many different countries, and in Sweden I find that we're very much in the it box, the objective, rational mind. That I mean, we don't go to church anymore, and there's not so much. It's very much, if you can't measure it, it doesn't exist. And you mentioned that you had this little bit in your crisis there, 2003 to 2005. So what are your thoughts on this?
If we look at Sweden, for instance, I think we have been quite materialistic. If it's not in the material, if you can't see it, it's not there. If you have mental health problems, you address it with you address it with the medication, for instance. So that's kind of the objective perspective. But latest year, I think we have talked a lot about culture also. So we talk a bit about, we are kind of fond of the World Value Survey, where Sweden has kind of an extreme position in very secular and very individualistic values. So we do talk a bit about the intersubjective as well. But we sometimes, I think our conversation in Sweden is that we tend to only take one perspective at the same time, and everyone should take that perspective. Not that much psychological perspective, but it's kind of getting very sweeping now. But I think we are still in the process of trying to integrate these and kind of moving seamlessly between these perspectives.
Yeah,
because I think these quadrants are perspectives.
Yeah, and isn't that the power of the model? That knowing this, that you can jump between the different quadrants, and like you need all of them, you know. Like for me, if you only have the rational mind but you don't have any spiritual work, or you don't have any like meditation practice, or you don't work with your thoughts, emotion and memories, it will not be complete. Like you need all four basically.
That's a really good takeaway here, to get all perspectives on the table, to see that even though you argue from an objective perspective and I come from an inter perspective, we both have different pieces of the truth.
Yeah.
So rather than fighting the truth, here are kind of four perspectives to truth that we all need to have the picture as complete as possible.
Yeah. So yeah, no, it's a good model too. And for the listeners, I recommend you to study more of Ken Wilber's work. And also you wrote a couple of blog posts about this on your blog, Kristian, right?
Yeah, I wrote it in Swedish.
Okay, yeah. So I think we have about 35% of the listeners in Sweden. So I will put a link to that blog post to learn more about this, because and just knowing this model helps you, because you can see the world through this just by seeing. You see it everywhere, basically, right?
If you zoom out, the more you zoom out to look at what development is, for instance, and understanding a culture, then the more useful this gets, I think.
Yeah, and for me, I like when engineers come into the personal development psychology space with engineering mind, because sometimes for the ones that are too much in the kind of like woo-woo, you know, just like feelings, emotions, and you need both perspectives. I like that you have the engineering background, but then you're also interested in the psychology part. Right? So development theories, that's something also you written a book of. Can you share about this?
Yeah, these quadrants are really useful, and it took me a while to kind of start using them and starting seeing that they are helpful. What really was helpful for me in Wilber's writing was the developmental perspective. So basically, if I'm writing, from my perspective, I was a bit in a bubble. I couldn't really say where I was and how did I get here. So when you ask about meaning in life, then you're often asking about how did I get here and where am I going. So what's I think the most interesting part in Wilber's writing and Wilber's perspective is the developmental view. So basically says his question, I think it's a good question, something like, how come that dirt came up to write poetry? How did we come from dirt to poetry? So that's the developmental story, and if the material and the natural science view of that's evolutionary theory. Okay, that's kind tells us which steps we went through to come here. But the interior perspective of that, so if we took a look at the quadrants and look, how did cultures evolve to this, and how do we as individuals evolve to this, where we are? This gives us a story of where we come from. And for me, that was really helpful in giving me a sense of meaning, in understanding where am I and how did I get here.
Okay, excellent. So now, yeah, we're sharing on the video again here the levels of development culture, how the different stages, and this is, I think, Ken Wilber's work, but he has taken many different theories together, right? Yeah,
and this is close to Claire Graves' work on spiral dynamics, I think. Yeah. So that's one way of showing a trajectory for what we can call cultural evolution. I also like Sean Gebser, his work that also Wilber gets a lot of magic, archaic, magic, mythic, and rational. That's kind of, those concepts come from Sean Gebser. So I think that's the best source for looking at cultural evolution, which is an area I think still need more work.
Yeah. Okay. So if we start at the bottom, the first, the archaic, what is that?
Basically, before we have that much of a language, we are kind of more. I'm not sure if I can kind of give a brief overview, but we start from the archaic to the magic. Magic is more where we have the hunter-gatherer societies. We kind of are in small bands. We have cave paintings from different parts of the world that we can see traces of this. So we are typically hunter and gatherers.
Mm-hmm.
So what's used, I think this is where Wilber's quadrants are useful, because you can see not only in the worldviews, how the worldviews develop, that Gebser was most interested in, but also how what we can see in the socio-technical realm, which is the lower right quadrant. So basically, we are hunter-gatherers. That's how we kind of make a living for ourselves.
Yeah, and that was started 50,000 years ago,
roughly. Yeah.
And then we move up to magic, mythic, which
then we come into the Neolithic revolution, where we started to growing our crops instead. So we kind of become more stable we don't move around as much. So we grow our crops, and we have the agricultural revolution. We have first of horticulture and then the agricultural revolution. So this is a kind of we see that the cultural evolution needs to go hand in hand with the technological evolution and food production and social systems and so forth. Mm-hmm. So this really gives a kind of a helicopter view of development. Mm-hmm. And then amber or mythic. So I think both those two for me kind of intersect in one. So we go from kind of the early societies where we have multiple gods to mythic god, which is a single god. For instance, in Christianity or Islam, we have a single god and a single nation. We have a birth of the nation state.
And I believe in the mythic state, it's like we are right, you are wrong, right? Kind of, it's a ethno group stage. Like,
yeah, pretty much ethnocentric.
Yeah, ethnocentric. So we are right and you are wrong, basically.
Yeah.
If you don't believe in our God, then everyone else is wrong.
Yeah.
And then the rational stage, and maybe because so many relatives of mine are engineers, that's why I see so much rational in Sweden. But I think we also have the other stages as well. So, so the rational state, how would you describe the rational stage?
I would say that we have the scientific revolution, and we all have kind of the kind of going from the geocentric to heliocentric worldview and the Copernicus view. Kind of this is where the Catholic Church and the science kind of goes apart. So we have the birth of modern science with the scientific method, and also kind of it's not a single. It's a shift that takes place on several domains. For instance, in scientific world, that's I would say Sir Isaac Newton's birth of the classical mechanics. That's kind of for me that's the rational mindset. We also have Descartes, have this from philosophy. So splitting inner from outer, and splitting the outer world from the inner mind. Also, we have the industrial revolution as well. So the orange mindset for me, that's formal logic in Piaget's terms. Also, that we see things as individuals, we see things as objects, and we see things as in terms of reductionism as well. So we can reduce different things into we can understand an atom by understanding its parts. So that's kind of how typically how science works, and what's kind of that has dominated this paradigm. But also, it's the orange rational mindset is also about universalism. A human being is a human being, nevertheless, which culture you are from. So human rights is born here as well. So a lot of things, and modern democracy is born here. So every person should have a vote, and
So it's
in
more
every individual.
Word-centric view than the mythic view, basically.
Yep.
Okay, excellent.
Those are the ideals.
Word-centric view. Yeah,
yep.
Okay. And then last 50 years, the pluralistic or postmodern, or
then it grows. This is really interesting, because now this is useful. This is useful for describing the trajectory of cultural evolution, but it's also starting to get, because the orange mindset, it's still kind of very dominant in large parts of the world, and we see these tensions, developmental tensions between different mindsets as well. So if we have the green or pluralistic way of thinking, we can trace that to, well, it started 50 years ago, it says there. Yeah, there are seeds before that as well. But basically, you have the human rights movement, you have postmodernism, and you have the gender equality movement, you have multiculturalism kind of coming from that as a reaction towards this view that you can't really have this quality, this kind of only seeing individuals and see that's general and universal. So it's kind of a suspicion towards universality. But also from material sciences, we have a chaos theory. Kind of the universe isn't that predictable, and you can't really go down and see that, explain the whole from the parts. So there's a kind of a complexity theory, and chaos theory grows from here. We also have quantum mechanics, who kind of defies the basic assumptions of the rational mind, where the observer comes in, and different perspective awareness comes in and shows that it's not that simple. Science is traditionally about getting a map of the world that corresponds to the world as good as possible. But here, the more perspectives we can take, the more we see that we can't really work like this. It's so perspective dependent. It's so dependent of which biases you have as an individual. So what we see, if you want to see some kind of pattern across the evolution here, is that awareness of the inner world gets more elaborated, of the outer world as well. So we kind of learn to take more perspective. We learn to think more complexly around things.
Yeah. So the integral worldview, you start to see the perspective from all the levels before, from what I understand.
Yeah, pretty much like that. I think it's kind of the ability to include and understand previous levels. It grows gradually, in my view. But as the main argument for integral is this, that okay, here are the approach that we really want. We see all these are different worldviews, and no worldview is kind of right where the other is wrong. They can be more or less elaborate. They can be more or less complex, and we want to bridge every one of them. We want to kind of map out and be able to integrate. Hence, integral theory. We want to integrate all worldviews and all levels in this case. Yeah.
So from what I understand, that in the previous levels, you have seen all previous levels as wrong, and you are right. But in the integral worldview, you can see that there's just lots of different perspectives, and there are some truths to all perspectives, basically.
Yeah. And I can, the developmental goal, if you say like that, is not only to see all perspectives, but to carry all perspectives, carry all worldviews, feel them inside you, which is kind of that's a large demand, but that's the ambition about it.
Yeah. So if you want to grow as a person in these levels of development, and you want to go to the next level, what are some things that one can do?
For me, first of all, I wouldn't use this level, this model with levels of cultural development, because if you want to grow, this is useful if we want to look at Sweden, for instance. Where are we in Sweden? Where there's a lot of green ingredients, a lot of green values. There is a lot of orange, and we see some conflicts around that. So how can we negotiate that? How can we have maybe some traditional values, some traditional amber values that's kind of are not seen as strange. Can we integrate those? So kind of on a cultural level, you would want to kind of be able to negotiate all these aspects and see how can all these perspectives have kind of their voice in this great orchestra. Yeah. But for you as an individual, that's kind of where because I thought this is really interesting. But if I want to, because I'm a researcher, I would be nice to stay in academia, because eventually I did finish my PhD. But I'm in the wrong field, I felt. So what's the field? I was interested in this developmental thought, and I started getting interested in adult development psychology, because that's the research field in academia, because these kind of frameworks are watched with suspicion from many cases. So what's the research field, and kind of where the evidence, because I started to get critical as well, where's the evidence that there is a developmental dimension to this?
Isn't that the engineering mind coming into the psychology field?
The engineering mind is very much about systemizing, which is where I kind of Wilber resonates a lot. But also Wilber gets a lot of critique because this is rigid, this is a framework, it's much more complex than this, which is, I think, a very fair critique. And I think we will see other kind of models coming as kind of complementing this, because it's a moving target to kind of describe what development is. But I went to the field of adult development psychology, and that's where you find names such as Piaget, which kind of as developmental psychology. You find Bob Keegan, you find Susan Cook-Reuter, Jane Lavinger, you find Michael Commons, for instance. So those are basically doing developmental models, because this is cultural development, what we've seen. So they use models for describing the individual development, kind of from childhood throughout life. And that's more interesting to see how I can grow as an individual.
So what are some levels there? Like when you are born, how many years is the first one? And
depends on which model you use. Yeah. But if you take Keegan's, for instance, which is kind of very coarse, you have 5 orders of development, where plus the zeros where you're born. And then that corresponds to some extent to what we saw before with the spiral dynamics view, or the integral theory cultural development view. But it's not a 1-to-1 relationship, and not a 2-to-1 either. So it's kind of, as an engineer, you want to systematize, but it's not typically not that simple. Yeah. So it's five levels, and the third order is kind of the traditional mind. The fourth order, that's the modern mind. That's the mindset where you need to operate in a modern society. And the fifth order, he called that postmodern mindset, which is kind of corresponds to green level, but it also comes up to higher degrees. That's kind of where you have not a whole of yourself. The kind of this is my core, this is my individual, my sense, and I have some properties I can engage with the world. But rather, there are different parts of me. I have different selves. I have several systems, and that becomes useful if you want to look at the previous levels that we saw on the previous map. To look at the previous levels, kind of what does myself look like at this level? What do traditional Kristian mean here? And what kind of Orange Oskar? Can I please speak to Orange Oskar? And then you speak from that voice and that mindset. Okay. Then you pretty much that you need different mindsets in order to you can't be too kind of having your boundary, and you need to let go of your boundaries to some extent in order to otherwise
So when you grow up, and if there is some challenges in one of those development stages, that kind of forms some kind of trauma, I assume. And what can you do, especially like the first, let's say 0 to 3 years old, like the first years when you don't even are aware what's happening? How do you deal with this when you're older?
Yeah, I mean, it's a big question, hard to kind of answer in generic ways. I think the notion of, I think he wrote a book called Integral Psychology, where he traced different types of traumas and kind of mapped different types of traumas to different developmental levels. That's one way of dealing with it. So it's, if you want to kind of map it, then how helpful it is, I'm not sure. But what I do see in mainstream debate is that the trauma perspective is really growing. And it's kind of getting more and more awareness. I see it in sustainability circles as well, that sustainability is fundamentally about trauma. And that's a really interesting perspective. It's not central in Wilber's view, but it's there in the model as well. But then how do you deal with trauma? That's kind of a huge issue because there are so many traumas. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, I mean, in Ken Wilber's work, he talks about growing up, which is getting more and more perspectives, waking up and cleaning up. Yeah, can you share a little bit about those 3 different ways of working with yourself?
Yeah, what I can mention here is from my perspective, kind of this is, first of all, I got kind of, I love the big picture view of everything, but then you typically want to answer how do you develop, how do you do it, what practices are there, and then it's maybe a good time to kind of shift into the inner development goals.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, good.
Because that was one way of the inner development goal is a project. It's initiated by three organizations, which is the Equaret Foundation and 29K and the New Division. And there we have my blog. Nice.
Yeah, I have a lot of windows open. There you go. Now
there we have it. That was a way of addressing. That was born out of frustration. 2 sources. First of all, frustration with not things happening quick enough in terms of sustainability. I mean, we have the Sustainable Development Goals, where they are from 2015, but also we have the systems theory and causal loop diagrams approach, limits to growth approach. That's 50 years old. So we've kind of had this systems view of the world for at least 50 years. Not much is happening. We're still burning like 80 to 85% fossil fuels. And there seems to be not awareness around this. So how do we, this kind of brings the focus inwards. The similar journey that I made, kind of from the outer world to the inner focus. What can we do, and what should we do in order to develop, and what is it that we developed? So first phase, we produced a framework with Thomas Jordan as scientific lead, and crowdsourced with a survey. Which skills and capabilities do you think should be that we need to develop in order to address the Sustainable Development Goals? And the result of that, over a longer process, roughly a year ago, came out in 23 skills ordered in 5 categories. So here you have from the being category, if you scroll down, for instance, you have 5 different skills. You have we need inner compass, we need integrity and authenticity, we need openness and learning mindset, and self-awareness and presence. So those are the kind of five skills that we argue from this perspective that we need to develop. And being, kind of the being category describes kind of, okay, who am I as a person? We need to have some sort of address that in some way. And then similarly, thinking, for instance, perspective skills and complexity awareness. Complexity awareness for me, it's very useful to think that 17 development goals is really hard to kind of see how they are interconnected. It's extremely complex. So we need to develop that on a cultural level. And also relating, which is the next category. So relating, for instance, okay, I think I'm home with myself. I know what my values are, and I'm present. I can think, I understand the complexity. I can take different perspectives, but also relating. How do I relate? How do I relate to a person in Dubai, for instance? How do I relate to a person that is most affected by the climate change? How do we relate more better to each other, for instance, in connectedness? So that's kind of bridging over to the collective side. So you may kind of sense that there is some quadrant thing going on here. So
yeah, the first
going from the
yeah, that's true. Yeah, this is inner. Yeah, and this is it or more. I see, and then yeah, this is more the collective. Yeah, okay.
Now we're moving down to the collective. How do I relate to other peoples and collaborating? How do we collaborate? And you talked a bit about
relating and collaborating are quite close to each other, but them different. Relating, okay, and then collaborating. Yeah, communication.
That I see them as relating is what you kind of how you relate. Collaborating is when you do stuff, when you make things happen. for instance, intercultural communication, that's kind of this, probably you have a lot of things to contribute in this.
Yes, absolutely. That's and I think going back to how to develop, this is just a side note, but going back to developing perspectives, one good way is to hang out with people that are different than you. So if you're an engineer, hang out with someone that is completely woo-woo into spirituality and yoga maybe. And if you're Swedish, hang out with someone from Pakistan, or hang out with someone from, so that's, and just be curious and open. But that's, that's a side note, but that's for me a way to develop perspective, I think.
Yeah. There's a lot of things you can do in your everyday life too, if you kind of have this, and just for as you describe here.
Collaborating, okay, excellent. And then the last one, acting,
driving change. So this is kind of, okay, how do we do this? This is more on what happens when it happens, and this is often in sustainability discussions, this is where the focus goes. Okay, we need to do something, we need behavioral change, how do we do it? So for me, this is what you see, how things, but a lot of methods and practices we see as examples are kind of having their center of gravity in the being or thinking, but they also address the acting, because you want to have some sort of outcome of it, some sort of change.
So if you're listening to this, after you listen, you can go to innerdevelopmentgoals.org, and there you can learn more about this. I'll put the link also in the podcast. But for me, I also do keynotes about how to future-proof yourself. And for me, these skills are very, I think, are needed to future-proof yourself, because the world is changing fast, the world is becoming more global. So these are all great skills that is needed. And I think Yuval Noah Harari, in his 21st Century book, he describes a couple of skills that are going to be needed for the future. And I think they're all found in those inner development goals, actually.
I haven't looked, but good notice.
Yeah. So what is your role in this? How are you involved in the inner development goals?
On the side a bit in the first phase, I kind of gave some short input. We were kind of a bunch of researchers and also central people around that. Then a year ago, I kind of got the question if I wanted to be the scientific lead of the second phase. So the first phase is, what is it that we need to develop? And the result is the framework. These are the skills. And the second phase is answering, how do we develop these skills? And for me, I jumped on this, but it's extremely challenging question, because I mean, we want to say something that from a research perspective is sound also. So this is what we've been entertaining ourselves with the last years, and asking how do we develop? Which I call this development activities. It can be methods, interventions, or practices, or things that you do in your daily life to develop.
Yeah, no, and that's also very complex, because everyone that starts on their kind of personal development journey finds a method that they kind of fall in love with. And they want everyone to use that method, but maybe that's not the best method. So the how is quite difficult. I mean, I'm into mental training, as I was sharing before, which is Unestål's method, and also different kind of meditations. But then I meet people that are into Vipassana, I meet people that are into transcendental meditation, and this is the best method there is. So,
exactly.
How do you evaluate?
And my question is, how do you know?
Exactly.
So
the engineering mind.
But also a critical mind. So how do you know? Because there are different ways we can kind of, if there is a lot of people interested, and a lot of people do Vipassana, okay, that's a good sign. It doesn't necessarily say it works, because it can be due to tradition. But probably, I mean, if there's kind of a community of practitioners that exchange experience around it, it's a good sign. And then
I think Unestål had something that how do you evaluate if a method is good or not? And because sometimes people say like, this is a great method, and then they join some kind of sect. So they feel better, but everyone in their surrounding think that that person is not. So it's about feeling better yourself, but also the other skills, collaborating and relating with others. So if you join a sect and you think that, wow, I feel so good now, but everyone in your surroundings like, wait a minute. So it's a complex. So what is the process you're doing to find out the best how?
We did a survey. And launched that in the beginning of the year. It took us quite a while, because it was an extensive survey, and we launched that a year ago, and we got over 2,000 responses on things people do to develop. And it could be from the individual perspective, kind of, this is what I do in my daily life, which is really useful. And then we have the organizational perspective, because this inner development goals is focused a lot around organizational context. How do organizations support their employees to grow? So what do the organizations do? But finally, and most importantly, the trainers and the experts who kind of share their knowledge. We had around 400 responses. Okay, please share around your practice or method or intervention. What is it called? How does it function? What does it lead to? Does it connect to any one of the IDGs? And so forth. So kind of ask these critical questions.
Okay.
And got a huge set of data. So I went through that, which took some time. And also it's hard to only from descriptions to see that if this method works or not. I mean, I need to try it.
Yeah, exactly. And that for me is like, for example, if you take NLP, and if you're listening to this and you don't know what NLP is, I interviewed a lot of guys in NLP. For example, Joseph O'Connor, that is like one of the leading experts on NLP. So I recommend you to listen to that episode. But basically, like you were saying, modeling was one of the things that they did in NLP. They look at what successful people did and how we can copy those strategies. And I use a lot of NLP models in my own life and also with clients. And the subjective feeling is that this works. Yeah. Then I know NLP has a lot of criticism because this is not research based, that but when I feel inside of me that I feel better, this works, I get results, I don't care if it's any research. The subjective feeling is like, okay, this works.
That's fair enough. And that's also its limitations of what we can see from a kind of a scientific perspective. So if you have some practice that is useful for you, I think it's good to kind of answer the critical question. Okay, how do I know that it works? It feels good, but it also feels good to be in a cult.
Exactly.
And critical thinking is also a skill that needs to be developed. But if it works, so it's just asking the question, how do I know it works? That's kind of have been guiding to go from all these methods that we have, which is kind of more than 100 different methods that people state, in order to have this, we want to produce a field kit, which is kind of a collection of conversation starters. These are different methods that we think are good example, because they do measurements before and after. There is a theory that it's kind of, there is a underlying theory that's sound, and it's kind of, if it's published in research, great, but we can't demand that from everyone. And also, does it kind of connect? Does it develop is it good in our context? Does it can be used for people or for organizations? Does it address the IDGs? So,
can anyone add to those, or is it already those people that you have asked? Or you asked 400 people, you said, or something?
The survey is still open, but we're doing the kind of analysis now, and we kind of will produce the field kit. But our ambition is to produce a platform as well. The platform where you can crowdsource and you can enter your own method and also try to, how do I address these issues? And then people can come in and share experiences of that. That's the vision. And that's what I think we will produce from it as well.
From my perspective, Unesco's mental training needs to be included in this, but that's, again, from my personal experience, this is a method that has changed my life. But there's also he's done research on it. So like when you do his longer course, you fill, of course it's subjective, but you fill out a survey before and you fill out the survey after, and everyone feels a response that they function and feel better in everyday life. So from my perspective, mental training needs to be included in that model. But maybe I can go and answer the survey.
Answer the survey, or kind of wait till the platform comes, and then it will probably be some traction around that. But it sounds like you should do that.
So where are you now? Like, how long what is the time frame? What is the goal to finish the how part?
We wanted to publish it 29th of April, but it was kind of too much data and too much. I mean, the initiative had grown in interest, so there are a lot of researchers around it who want to give their input, and so now we have a kind of non-negotiable deadline at 20th of September. That's where we publish the field kit, and hopefully we'll have a platform by then as well.
Okay.
So platform means some online tool where you can enter different and kind of share different practices.
Yeah. So another thing is that there are so many methods to improve your life, and many of them work. I think all of them probably work in some way. Some maybe better, some not so good, and maybe some are more research-based and some are not. But then is the willingness. It's the last part of Ken Wilber's thing, like showing up, like actually doing the work.
Yeah.
So it doesn't matter if you have the goals and you have the method, but if no one is actually using it, because change is a little bit. So how are you going to solve that problem?
Yeah. For Wilber, I think it's a similar trajectory as Wilber, because he started out to asking those big questions. What does enlightenment mean? Well, how did we develop to come here? And he has kind of going from map making to practice more. Yeah. So he had a book with Terry Patton and 2 more on integral life practice. And then he had a book a couple of years ago on a new religion, where he kind of wants to have a fourth turning of the Buddhist practices. So he's arguing for, first of all, he takes the point of view, he takes the question of what is enlightenment? How do you develop? And he has 4 answers to that. So the first is kind of, waking up. That's the spiritual traditions. Yeah. So, and I think this is a very useful way of understanding it, because we have trauma perspective, we have enlightenment, that's spiritual perspective, we had adult development perspective. There are so many different perspectives. So what personal development means is different depending on who you ask from this perspective. And I did the kind of data on analysis of all the all the trainers, what they kind of had their practices and development activities, and found at least 10 different clusters. Kind of here we have the mindfulness, and here we have transpersonal, and here we have trauma, and here we have leadership, and here we have organizational development. It was so broad. So what Wilber did is kind of to have these 4 aspects of what does development means. So first, the waking up, that's the spiritual traditions of kind of enlightenment. How do you do that? Typically by meditation. And then there is growing up. That's the adult development perspective, the developmental perspective. How do I go from one worldview to the next? And that's also coming from adult development psychology. It's a hard question to answer, because there are no studies that really show that are valid across all stages. There's no single recipe for doing that. There are some kind of self-evident things you can do. Treat people well and give them good circumstances and good context to grow in, and then hope for the best. Challenging support, challenging tasks and support and things like that. So that's kind of waking up and growing up. And then he added cleaning up. That's the Freudian or shadow or Jungian or shadow perspective, because that's kind of, we have kind of different traumas in life, and that we repress parts of ourselves. And cleaning up is kind of to reintegrate those parts of ourselves, those disowned parts of ourselves. And that's kind of, for me, shadow and trauma are different things, but they intersect to some extent, because they have similar view of, and kind of typically shadows come from some sort of trauma. But now trauma is very popular in the mainstream. And we have Thomas Ebel and Gabor Mate, for instance, are people
Mate
talking about it.
Amazing.
Yeah, is really, and kind of the relation between addiction and trauma is really interesting. Also, it's really useful in this way.
So for the listeners, if you haven't watched Gabor Mate, he's been on many podcast Team Ferris. There's a lot on YouTube. So study his work. So yeah.
And finally, the 4th one.
The last one. Yeah.
So waking up, growing up, cleaning up, and then finally showing up, he added later. And the showing up, I started looking for what does he mean by showing up, really. But I found it is, for me, it's 2 things. First of all, just showing up to life and be present with whatever happens. If I'm in relationship to you, how can I show up to that, rather than kind of being in my phone? And that's not how we show up.
So show up present and
being present, show up to the world. So that's kind of the one aspect I see, and the other aspect is kind of engaging. That's kind of activism. So that's
okay. So that's basically number 5 on your IDGs, no? Acting.
Yep. Yeah. And also we see that when I go through the data also, and what people do, all these aspects are present here. So we see this as kind of, we see developmental aspects, we see mindfulness initiatives. We also see the trauma, but also see the activism.
Yeah.
So for individuals say that, what do you do to kind of grow? Well, I engage in sustainability issues, political engagement. I help others. So things like that.
Yeah. Okay. Excellent. No, so I think that's a good final point, because it kind of overlaps then the 5 goals with Ken Wilber's work. It's there's a lot of overlap, I see.
There is, yeah, I think, and it's not. We also think we haven't used any integral theory, so there's no framework underlying, which is a conscious choice, because it's ideological, because people if you use a certain framework, other groups kind of get suspicious. So we wanted to kind of be inductive in that way, to create the first framework just based on the data that people got, that people used, and also similarly here in the kind of ordering, the kind of overviewing and mapping all these methods. No theory, no underlying theory framework, no integral theory. But I can see afterwards that, okay, if you look at Wilber's 4 aspects, all of these are present in the data. So it's a good sign that we are kind of covering a lot of space, except for mental training.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, but
so there are no guarantees.
I think you can relate mental training to all parts, actually, to growing up, waking up, cleaning up. You can use it for all those, actually, because there's a whole sequence of trainings, and you start with muscular relaxation, which is related to the body, and so you can probably relate it to all, actually, somehow. You work a lot with self-confidence and self-esteem training, which is probably part of growing up, maybe, or something like this. So, but yeah, that's a topic of another discussion. But yeah, no, this is really interesting, and I look forward to see more of this. And where do you see the future of IDG? And do you have like a 2030 goal that same like SDGs?
Not really, but there's a third phase, because still we are, I mean, there's a huge variety of models, but still we have a pretty heavy bias, cultural bias. It's a Scandinavian bias, but it's also a Western bias in the methods. We do have the kind of mindfulness practices inspired from the East. We don't have very much indigenous practices. So the next phase, we want to validate the framework and kind of go broader in different cultures and look what does it look like here in these parts of the world. Do they come up with the same skills, or what does the overlap look like? So, and then implementing. Okay, given that we have these practices that we think these are good examples, can we build training out of this? Can we kind of do a course or some sort of program, leadership development program of this? And so that can we evaluate that and see if that brings us closer to the sustainable development goals? Does it work? How can we evaluate that? So that's kind of where we want to make it more practical.
Okay, interesting. So last question. If you had a magic wand and you could teach something to everyone on the planet, what would you teach them?
I have no idea. Yeah.
System mechanics or
yeah, structural mechanics.
Structural mechanics.
I mean, for like one skill, or
yeah, you had a magic wand and you get like 10 minutes with everyone, and here are some skills I think you should focus on. I can only ask for myself what I would need more of, but otherwise I think it would be counterproductive for other parts of groups. For instance, if I say connectedness, which I think is really important, I have a quite individualistic mindset, so connectedness is kind of where I would go. But then in other parts of the world, connectedness may not be the problem, but maybe you want to be more individualized in that sense. So that's one criteria we have is context. So nothing works in all contexts. So that's kind of my boring research answer. So maybe getting perspectives and by context. Yeah. Okay. So no, thank you, Kristian. And if people want to get involved in the inner development, what are some ways they can do that?
Well, we have gatherings. I think monthly gatherings where we have different kind of guests who speak from their perspective, and we have interactions around that.
And that's you can find it on
a good way in
inner development goals.org.
Yep.
Innerdevelopmentgoals.org, and also your blog. You've written a few posts in English as well, or?
Yeah, I have the blog fication.se,
Yeah.
That's where I write most in English, not that frequently later, but that's where some of my writing is. And also in Swedish, I write at komplexitet.se.
Yeah,
and
put links to that in the blog, in the text to this podcast. And thank you so much for taking the time. And I believe what you guys are doing is important, and I want to be part of this as well, because this is how we can make the future better. Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
I could also mention that if you're Swedish and interested in adult development, my book Vuxen men inte färdig is kind of giving that introduction, different stage theories for the critical reader.
Okay, excellent. Vuxen men inte färdig. Yeah,
yep.
That's
so adults but not complete. Stages of complex thinking and meaning making.
Excellent. Okay, thank you so much, Kristian.
All right.